Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another week of Culture and Power. I hope everybody had a restful weekend. So this week we are reading through sort of anthropology and its discontents. We'll get to some a little more theory next week as well. But given sort of what we read and our discussion last week, this was a good segue for us. I don't know that we'll run the entire hour today. We might. One never knows. But we are going to jump in, and if we don't go the entire hour, that's totally fine. Give you all a little more time to read and catch up. I am going through, myself and Justin are in conversation with you all on Perusall, and we'll continue to be in conversation with you all on Perusall about your about the readings, and we'll do this more intensely going forward as well. So keep an eye out for comments and discussions and questions, and feel free to at me if in Perusall if you have specific questions for me that you want to make sure that I don't miss, because there's a lot. But I try to get through all of them. But if you want me to be sure to catch something, or if there's something that you feel it's urgent, feel free to use the little @ function or hashtag in Perusall. So, all right, let's get cracking. This morning we're going to talk about representation. So let me get the screen over here for you. And get cracking on that. What we're going to try to talk about is representation, and not just representation, right? On one side, we're going to talk about it within and of anthropology and scientific disciplines in general, right? And we're also going to talk about it in the context of research topics and participants. So this issue of representation, I think, is quite important, and especially because in ethnography, right, we are writing culture, we are writing about culture, we are writing about people, and in your projects, for example, the things that you'll need to do as you are talking about the topics and about the groups of people that you are interested in exploring, right? We want to make sure that we're being conscientious about how we're talking about them, but that also we're being fair in our representation, right? And that we're not reinforcing tropes and stereotypes that we bring with us from our societal influences, right? And the more that we talk about and unearth these things, the easier it will be for us to avoid those repeating and reinforcing those tropes. So here's what we're going to do in talking about all of those things. All right, this is how we're going to talk about those things in this way. Let's see. So St. Clair Drake's Anthropology and the Black Experience, right, is this piece that we've read. Now, we could read this in a variety of ways, and I could have assigned it at the very, very beginning of class because it, on its face, right, it is a history of the development and ideological changes and debates in the discipline of anthropology, right? But it's also about other social sciences, right? It's not just, I mean, he's focusing on anthropology because he is an anthropologist, but it's not this phenomenon, these experiences are not limited to the discipline of anthropology, right? And some of y'all, as you were going through the readings and some of your comments were like, dude, why is anthropology so jacked up? And it's not that anthropology is so jacked up. Like, we have this history and we have this this origin story in the development of the discipline, but so does every other discipline in academia, because academia was established in the exact same way, right? So, and another important thing to remember is that it's this history of the development and ideological changes up to 1980, right, when this is published. There's another 40 years after that. That's distressing to think about, but 40 years of shifts and changes, right, and debates since this article was published. But I've included it, and the others will read this week, because these are discussions and these are voices, right? St. Clair Drake is often left out of the canon despite having been a really important theorist and contributor to anthropology, precisely because of who he was as a Black anthropologist, right? And because he was an outspoken critic, right? He made his critiques clear, right, about what the discipline was doing and what academia was doing in general, right? But he's left out of the canon still because of the very same systems and power dynamics in academia that Drake outlines in the article, right? But the article is also an object lesson, right? And the importance of representation of varied perspectives. And some of y'all were starting to pick up on this in your notes in perusal as well, right? It's not just that he's giving us this sort of history, he's also giving us a clue as to what we miss when we exclude voices, right? When we homogenize information, access to information, perspectives so intensely, right? And intentionally, we end up missing a whole lot, right? I'm just toggling back and forth so I can make sure I'm not missing any comments or anything, or questions that you all have. So just bear with me as I go back and forth here. My screens are being weird this morning. While pointing out, right, while Drake is pointing out these important issues in the discipline and in the academy in general, again, right, remember, this wasn't and isn't just a problem of anthropology, but in literally every subject of the academy, which has historically been a space reserved for wealthy white men. That's how it was started. It's why in the era of civil rights movements and starting in the 1950s, HBCUs were established, right, to create a space where it was okay to be Black and go to school, right? It's why, as we were talking about before, and as Drake points out in the article, why Zora Neale Hurston's going to the academy, going to study with Boaz, going to study at Columbia in New York, right, which is far, far away from Florida, right? Doing all of those things as a Black woman is a big deal, right? It's that context, it's that holistic perspective, right? So Drake is providing us with these examples of the importance of nuanced discussion, right? Not just overgeneralizing and saying, all of anthropology is bad, or like it has this history and it sucks, right? That's not what we're saying, right? It's seeing that the variety of perspectives in the situation and situations that it gives rise to, right? And so this is really important. Consider, for example, what Chief Justice Roberts recently said about diversity in physics. I'm not sure how many of you are STEM majors, and of those of you who are, how many of you are identify as people of color or not white in general, and or women, or any of the identities within the LGBTQI community. This is what he said is important for all of us to consider, right? But it might resonate with you just a tad bit more if you are in any of those groups. I'm going to click in here and share this screen. Need a just going to share the screen real quick so you can see the headline. And we'll switch back. So there's this case where they're talking about diversity in classrooms and accessibility for classrooms, not just in universities or not just in grade schools, but also in universities. And it's about the case, right, is the Supreme Court case about affirmative action in university admissions processes, right? And so Chief Justice Roberts, this dude right here, that guy, said, absolutely, in all seriousness, like nonplussed, just this is the, this was what he was, it was his genuine concern. What unique perspective does a minority student bring to a physics class? And then he says, you're counting those among the classes in which there are no minority students. I'm just wondering what the benefits of the diversity are in that situation. He's like, why do we need Black people in physics? Why do we need brown people in physics? Why do we need Indigenous people in physics? Why should we care? Right? That is what the questions he's asking intimate, right? He's saying, why is that important? Why does it matter? And so anybody who is Black, brown, or Indigenous, right, is going to be particularly affected by that kind of statement, right? And that is a Chief Justice. That is somebody who is at one of the highest levels of power held in this country, right? So it matters what he's saying, right? So I want to talk about this for just a second because it relates to what Drake's argument was 40 years ago, right? Diverse perspectives and representation in classrooms and disciplines isn't just important in discussion-based courses like ours, which it would normally be a much more discussion-based course where we in a classroom. But it's also important because our worldviews and cultural norms can influence how we think and problem solve important puzzles, right? Just thinking about all of the discussions that we've had, I'm sure you can think of a few examples in which diversity is actually really important to getting a different perspective, right? And thinking, oh, I haven't thought about it that way before. That's useful. That's a great way to think about this, or that's something different. And I would have never thought about that because it's not how I was enculturated. It's not how I was taught to process the world around me, right? But if you can't think of some examples, I'm going to give you a few more. Right. And I want to bring this back to our discussion about objectivity and subjectivity. A lot of y'all are getting stuck on the negative aspect of this, right? But it's a double-edged sword, right? There are also benefits, right? So if our worldviews and cultural norms can influence how we think to make us better problem solvers, then those subjective influences, right, can and do make us better scientists. Right? So it's not just that they can create biases, but they can also be really beneficial. Also, again, right, basically asking, what's the big deal if science classrooms are all white or mostly white, is not only a blatant example of white supremacy and regurgitation of the kinds of epistemological violence that we've been exploring the past couple of weeks, but it also completely dismisses the accomplishments and contributions, further erasing from the canon of each discipline, not just anthropology, every discipline, right, of Black and brown and indigenous and women and transgender and queer social and natural scientists, right? It's why we haven't heard about the works and research of women and Black women in STEM, like the Black women mathematicians that were integral to NASA's first successful piloted trip to the moon and back, for example, right? All of those stories that we're just now starting to hear about, or that are being popularized so that we get a peek into a history that has always been there, but has been intentionally ignored or erased, right? Because people at the highest seats of power ask questions like, what does diversity add to the classroom, right? What does diversity add to physics? It's also why, right, we haven't heard about Black physicist Edward Boucher's work in fractal geometry, or Fred Begay, indigenous physicists' work on laser, electron, and ion beams, right? Or why people think of Bill Nye the Science Guy, right, before they think of Neil deGrasse Tyson, if they think of Neil deGrasse Tyson at all, right? These issues matter, right? And are exemplary of the kinds of problems that St. Clair Drake is identifying, and also trying to say, hey, look, if we include these perspectives, right, if we create these spaces, we don't even need to create the spaces exist if we allow, right, the inclusion of a diversity of ideas into these spaces. We'll actually see much more thorough, much better science, not just because one person or another person of a specific identity is doing it, right, but because it contributes to this broader iterative process of knowledge production and feedback, in which we can all grow our intellect, right, and think differently and problem solve differently, or in a way in which we can be collaborative, right? It's not a competition. We are collaborating as a species to survive, to innovate, to create, right? And so when we can come together and have these different ideas, right, and these different perspectives, we can problem solve more quickly, right? Numerous, for example, IO studies, right, in organizational psychology, and in business and human resources, right, have demonstrated, right, that the more diverse, and not just in name only, right, but the more inclusive workspaces are, and research groups are, the more robust the findings and the information, and the quicker problems get solved, right? And the more and more thoroughly, right, with fewer needs to go back and correct things, because you have a whole bunch of different folks using their subjectivities, right, and their subjective enculturation and experiences to really shape solutions, right? To shape research questions in the first place, to think about ideas differently, right? In ways that really make an enormous difference. Okay. So let me see. All right, so this works in multiple directions, this issue of representation. It's not just that representation of the researcher in these institutions is important, right? And then that is super important. But it's also related to representing people, right? So let's talk for a second about the other side of that representation, right? These diverse perspectives, and those subjective social influences again, right? Darn things, affect how people research topics and how people, research topics. Apparently, I've neglected my grammar there. And participants are represented, right? And that representation matters. So think about, if you're like, what does this representation issue mean? Why is that relevant? Think about the way that the media, for example, represents groups of people. Think about, for example, the pandemic, right? And the origins of, or the suspected origins of the virus, and why it became so, or why it is so contagious, right? Which has nothing to do with individual identities, right? But the media did try to paint it that way, right? And so entire groups of people, right, were represented in a specific way that then had very real effects on life, right? So the media, in the course of just a few weeks, right, and with the aid of other higher level institutions, right, were able to create or reproduce, right, because it's not the first time that this has happened, we're able to reproduce anti-Asian sentiment, and in particular anti-Chinese sentiment, really vociferously, right, and in these really insidious ways. That is representation. That is using, it's telling a story, right? It's using narrative and it's using discourse to paint a picture about a group of people, right? And if that representation is not accurate, right, it misrepresents a group of people. Now, there are often, sometimes that is unintentional, right? It's based in ignorance, or it's based in specific subjectivities, but in many cases, like with the media, for example, journalists and things like that, it's based in power structures, right? It's based in these ideological apparatuses, these ideological mechanisms that that they then work to inform. So if we go back to that base and superstructure, right, that we were talking about, representation is then iterative, right? It's dialectic. It's part of this feedback loop. Are y'all, is this making sense? Use like exclamation points or question marks to give me a sense that you are getting it, or that you still have questions. But right, it's part of this dialectic. And so that's one example. Okay, brilliant. Awesome. Sometimes I over-explain, sometimes I under-explain, sometimes it's way too meta. So hopefully that's, my metaphors and examples are working today, so that's great. So representing people and phenomena, right, can both reflect societal relationships, but it can also, right, as I was saying, maintain, reproduce, reinforce these societal relations that are already present. But, right, one corrective for this is including the perspectives of researchers and in such a way, right, that the researchers themselves and institutions are sufficiently representative of difference and different ways of thinking. then the ways of talking about phenomena and the humans involved in that phenomena, right? Especially in the cases, even in the cases, not even just especially, but in the case of social sciences and biology and chemistry and physics and everything else, but biology and chemistry, right, are sort of inherently involve humans, especially the way that we study it, right? It's more likely to be representative, right? The way that we talk about these things, right? So when, no, not always. No, I'll talk about that for a second too. It is more likely to be representative when there is a diversity of perspective, right? When there is a variety of perspective, when it is representative of the world at large, right? In terms of people and the people doing the research. This is also why subjectivity matters. It's also why objectivity, right, is a curtain, right, that tries to protect the homogenization of information, right? And it is an attempt to obscure, right, the fact that we have these subjective realities, right, and lived experiences. So there are instances, there are ways, right, that the ideological mechanisms, right, that the superstructure and the base, right, so that iterative process, but that at the level of the superstructure, these ideas become so powerful that they are internalized by the and then practiced by the very same groups that they actually manage, control, oppress, um, uh, uh, and otherwise disadvantage, right? So what do I mean by that? So there are ways in which, right? So when, for example, St. Clair Drake is talking about how Zora Neale Hurston must have played the game at some point, right? She must have played the academic game well enough that she was able to succeed and do what she needed to do. But in order to do that, she had to participate in some of these like backwards processes, like measuring the craniums of the skulls of Black and brown folk, because that's what the dominant ideology in the sciences was. That doesn't mean that she didn't that she agreed with it, right, or that she didn't protest. And but it also doesn't mean that she did. But there are ways in which one can internalize, for example, misogyny, an institutionalized and deeply held hate of women, right? This misogyny. There are ways that women against whom misogyny is directed can also engage in misogynistic activities, right? There are ways that people of color can engage in white supremacist rhetoric, right? If they have internalized these messages and normalized them, right? And that's not always an active process. It's not always like an active choice, right? Women who engage in misogynist practices, right? So who go after other women, don't necessarily realize that they've internalized these misogynist messages, right? That these higher systems of power are working on them too. And it's not because they aren't intelligent, right? There are lots of really, really intelligent people who are really wrapped up in these ideological systems, right? I'm going to switch this just so that it's not bothering you all. Right, who are really wrapped up in these ideological systems, and don't realize it, right? So that's when we start talking about agency. That's when we start talking about, so in Marxist theory, right, so Marxist theory, right? There is a way of talking about this in terms of consciousness, being aware of these broader systems, right? Marx himself kind of, well, he was sort of elitist in a lot of ways. And one way was sort of about the way that he, rather than acknowledge that these systems are so pervasive and it's really difficult for us to unlearn what we've been enculturated with and what has come to seem like common sense our entire lives, he basically made it sound like people were just stupid. And that's not really fair to people. And also doesn't give enough credit to the power of ideological systems and how entrenched our enculturation is, right? And how hard it is to unlearn things that feel like core values, or that seem so common sense as to create a safety net. We actually have a physiological reaction. It's part of the reason why arguing on the internet about ideological things is so hard, and so contentious, is because when someone's worldview is challenged, right, or when someone's really deeply held beliefs are challenged, even with factual information, right? Even if all things being equal, economists love to use that phrase, and nothing is ever, all things are never equal, right? But all things being equal, right, being presented with this information and with these facts, it might be more persuasive. The issue isn't persuasion, right? The issue is actually sense of safety, right? And the psychological effect, it's called the backfire effect, right? There's actually a really fantastic cartoon about it that I love deeply, right? But it's the idea that that if a notion challenges our idea that's part of our way of life, right? It feels like a threat to our safety, right? It feels like chaos, but it also feels like a primal threat, like we are in danger. And so our reaction is to shut down, or to it's either to shut down and walk away, to move away from the danger, or it's to react in an effort to eliminate the danger, right? And so when we have these ideas, right, it becomes really difficult. And so it's part of the reason why it's really hard to unlearn something that we have been raised with from childhood, or have been inundated with, not just necessarily raised by our parents or our immediate community, but we're enculturated through all of these other systems, through media, through games, through consumption, through various different kinds of messaging, through music, through all kinds of art and literature and everything else, right? And so if all of that sort of sings the same note, it becomes really difficult to say, well, maybe there are other notes, until somehow, right, you've allowed for the possibility that there might be something else, right? So that's part of, so this idea that this is how the world works, right? Marx called this false consciousness, right? So the example of the internalized misogyny, right? For that person, for a woman who practices misogyny. It's the same for men who practice misogyny, right? They have been enculturated into this idea, right, that women are inferior, that women are potentially less than human, and that women are not deserving of respect or anything else that you might give an equal human, right? It's the same way that those sort of discriminatory isms work in general, right? There are variations, but we'll get to those in the next few weeks. But for this example, right, that enculturation becomes very difficult. It seems like that is reality, right? And that's the false consciousness that that Marx is talking about, and that Marxist theory sort of uses, right? With some modification, right? There's a lot more allowance for agency and a lot more allowance for it's not just because people are stupid. It's much bigger than that. So when groups talk about raising awareness or consciousness raising, or that kind of discussion about alternatives, different ways of thinking, right? That is, so it's part of the dialectic, right? But it's also like, until there is this process of unlearning, right? Until that consciousness is raised, there's still a lot of antagonism there, right? And so that base and superstructure is iterative in that way, right? If it benefits the the dominant ideology of the time, those ideological institutions, right, are going to constantly reinforce those relations within society, right? So the trolling we see, the interpersonal trolling that we see on internet mediums and social media forums, for example, is a part of, right? So it informs that ideological apparatus, but that ideological apparatus is also informing and reinforcing those antagonisms, those social relations at the base, right? Everybody still with me? Still following along here? Cool. Okay. If y'all have questions, or you're like, feel free to pop in. And if not here, feel free to ask in Perusall, or send me an email, or if you want to chat about it in office hours, or like have more of a conversation around this, we can absolutely do that. But this is the issue, right, with at the basic level of representation. Now, as you're going in and reading Vine Deloria, the chapter on anthropologists and other friends, right? And as you're reading Talal Assad's piece, right? Vine Deloria himself wasn't an anthropologist per se, but he did a lot of he was absolutely a social theorist and an activist, but had, as a Native American, had a lot of interaction with I forget off the top of my head which I can't remember if he's Sioux. Anywho, I can't remember what nation he's from off the top of my head, and I don't have my book handy. But and as you're reading Talal Assad's piece, right? So Talal Assad is Arab anthropologist, right? Arab American anthropologist, and right, they both have some critical things to say about excuse me, about anthropology. But they're also not saying that it's hogwash, right? Um, uh, it's more of cautionary tales. There are now, so St. Clair Drake was talking about this, and there are now a number of Native American anthropologists, Black anthropologists, um, a number of actually very well known and well respected Black anthropologists and Native American anthropologists. Groups that have historically been excluded. Lots of Latino or Latinx anthropologists as well. But and increasingly in other parts of the world, in previously colonized parts of the world, right? There are lots of anthropologists as well, especially social anthropologists like St. Clair Drake was talking about, and or sort of focusing on, right? And that helps make anthropology better, right? Because we get different perspectives. They ask different questions. They ask better questions in many instances, right? That get to the root of what needs to be discussed, what needs to be talked about. The big issues that tell us about humanity, rather than merely reinforcing these old tropes and these old ideas about society and about and these power structures. And that's also what he's talking about when he's talking about studying up. Sorry, guys, my hair is losing its mind, and it's in my face. But that's also what he's talking about when he's talking about studying up. He's talking about the ways that those with less power are both engaging in a new compared to historically sort of colonial era and stereotyped racial anthropology, who are doing this anti-racist radical anthropology, really, right? And I know we've been enculturated to think that radical is like a scary word, but it just means very different from the status quo. So don't be afraid of the word radical. When we talk about radical anthropology, we're talking about a paradigm shift from previous eras of praxis, right? So there's radical everything, and radical sociology, radical physics, radical, mathematics, people who are challenging long-held ideas, right? And when they do that, we find out some really cool stuff, like the research on human reproduction, right? It's a radical departure, a very different world, right? A very tangible, different paradigm shift from just 30, 40 years ago, right? So that's what we're talking about. So when we hear those words, radical, Marx, they're not scary words. They're just people who did research and do stuff. But again, it goes back to that idea of how we've been enculturated, and how new information or information that challenges what we've come to understand as common sense can be scary. And we have that physiological reaction, which is why I want you all to be reflexive when you have those responses, right? Have your response, but at the same time, give yourself the space to say, okay, why did I have that response? Let's explore that a little further. Let me process that. What ideas do I have? What notions have I been taught? that lead me to believe what I believe, right? And that make me averse to talking about this other thing, right? And as you explore that, you might find that your reaction softens, right? And a few things might happen. You will either uh, potentially begin to shift thinking, right? You will reinforce your ideas with an understanding of why you hold those ideas, and therefore strengthen sort of your core beliefs, but in a way that is reflexive and takes into consideration all of the possibilities, right? So it's a win-win, really, when we're sort of open-minded about these things. But we can see, right, how we embody enculturation if we sort of in an autoethnographic way practice some holistic anthropology on ourselves when we have those moments, right, as we're processing this information. It's also part of the reason why I'm giving you the readings that I'm giving you and asking you to engage with them in the way that I want you, or that I'm asking you to engage with them, because I want to help you develop those sort of critical analysis skills. So we're not just reading for face value, we're also getting all of these other contexts, right? And getting all of this other information, and pulling out all of this other important messaging, right? This sort of meta level theory, right? About human relations, the way the world does, could, might work, right? So not just the way that it does work, not just reality, or what is real right now, I should say, right? But also possibilities, futures, potentialities, and the sort of sometimes dual currents, right? Things that are happening behind the scenes, right? As a way to develop consciousness, we could say, right? So in that way, right, as you're reading, don't just look at it at face value, and also try really hard. Some of y'all are like, man, what is even the point of all of this? And I appreciate nihilism. I do. I fall prey to it occasionally. But try really hard to avoid sort of fatalistic or nihilistic reactions, or put the question to yourself in all seriousness. If you're asking what the point is, try to find one. If this is what's going on, why bother? If that's your question, right? Why bother? What is the value in it, right? So we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to try to figure out what's really going on, what the big picture is, and use that holism, right? That is so important in anthropological analysis, right? Anthropological study. Okay, we are going to end it there. I don't have more to add for you today, but just thinking about, so keep thinking about representation. So who's talking? So representation, positionality, objectivity, subjectivity, right? Epistemology, right? These ideas about how knowledge is produced, who is producing it, why it's being produced. So, right, going back to that base and superstructure idea, or the creation of ideology, right? Or how ideology, the dialectic of ideology, I should say, right? And how we think about these things and how we shift our ideas. So you'll read Anthropologists and Other Friends, and Anthropologists in the Colonial Encounter, or Anthropology in the Colonial Encounter, for Thursday. We'll have discussion on that. Feel free to bring questions directly to lecture on Thursday as well. You can just type them in, or you can email them to me ahead of time, and I can incorporate them as well, sort of like a reading or topic AMA for issues and themes and stuff thus far. If you have other questions, you know where to find me during office hours or via the emails. Important. If you have not already, please check your journal entry, your comments for your question and idea proposals. Some of you already have, but look at the feedback. If there are follow-up questions that you need to answer, please answer those. It will be an ongoing sort of iterative process. And we will also be thinking about the literature, the anthropological literature that you want to review, right? So this is not going to be like newspapers and popular media stuff. Like this is part of the scholarship, right? So you're doing a literature review, you should be looking at anthropological literature. So you can use the database searches or the journal searches via the library website. If you get stuck or you have questions or you would like some guidance on what literature might fit your topic, if you don't already have an idea, or if you want to run it by me, do that. You can do that. I would recommend sending me an email rather than respond to your journal entries for sure. But if you have additional questions and you want me to catch them quickly, or you want to get started on that because it is going to be due in just a couple of weeks, the literature review, go ahead and start thinking about those things. I've tried to space it out so that you have time. It's only a minimum of 3 articles. You can do more if you want to, but you really don't need to. You can build on that as you're going, but I want you to do the literature review assignment on 3 scholarly pieces, right? So again, that's in Blackboard, that's under the assignment, but that's what's coming up. So thank y'all. I will see you on Thursday. Have a great day, and we will chat again soon. Bye, everybody.